The bell over the door at the small country station in Andover, New Hampshire, gives a half-hearted ring. It's late afternoon, quiet. No clerk behind the counter. Just the smell of gasoline, cold coffee, and something else. Metallic, wrong. A customer calls out. No answer. Behind the counter, on the floor of this out-of-the-way stop on Route 4, a man lies motionless. Cash drawer ajar. Blood pooled where no one in this town expects to see it. His name is Everett Delano. Within minutes, this ordinary rural gas station will become one of New Hampshire's most stubborn unsolved crime scenes. To understand the killing of Everett Delano, you have to understand where it happened. Andover, New Hampshire, sits in Merrimack County, not in the crowded southern tier near Manchester or Nashua, but farther northwest, on the way to nowhere in particular, unless you live there. It is a town defined by back roads, low ridgelines, and water, the Blackwater River cut into its center, marshland along its banks, small lakes and ponds carved by ice ages long before anyone put a gas pump in the ground. Drive it today, and the basic layout is the same as it was in the 1960s. Route 4 and Route 11 cross this area, not as roaring interstates, but as rational compromises between terrain and speed. 2 lanes, some stretches straight, others forced to bend around hills or follow the old right-of-way of the Northern Railroad. Traffic is steady but not dense. Locals, commuters, loggers, travelers avoiding the main highways. In the mid-1960s, Andover was smaller, quieter, and even more isolated by the standards of the time. No smartphones. No GPS cars had AM radios and paper maps. If you broke down on Route 4 at night, you were relying on whoever happened to come by and whoever might still have their lights on in a nearby business. One of those businesses was a small gas station and service stop in the area known as Potter Place, just off the fork where Routes 4 and 11 run together for a stretch. This wasn't a modern convenience store with bright branding and a dozen security cameras. It was a practical building, modest footprint, a couple of pumps, a service bay or 2, a small front counter inside. Fluorescent tubes lit the ceiling. A counter separated the public from the cash, the cigarettes, and the handwritten charge slips. Behind that counter, a worker would stand for hours, ringing up purchases, making change, chatting briefly with people he often knew by name. The smell inside was a mix of fuel vapor from outside, rubber, oil, and maybe coffee if someone had bothered to make a pot. This was where Everett Delano spent part of his working life. He was not a drifter passing through. He was a local man, described in public records as a family man and a Navy veteran. He took on the job at the station as so many did in small-town New England, steady work in a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, or at least thought they did. Andover in that era wasn't the kind of place where people anticipated armed robbery. The nearest city with any consistent violent crime in the statistics was miles away. The police presence in town was limited. You did not see patrol cars circling every hour. You saw a cruiser when there was a call, or when an officer passed through on their way somewhere else. On the day of the shooting, that geography and that low-key policing structure mattered. What we know from state records and cold case summaries is this. Everett was at the station, working. At some point, someone entered with the intent to rob the place. During that incident, the robber shot Everett. Everett was discovered on the floor behind the counter, gravely wounded. He did not die instantly. He survived for a period of time before succumbing to his injuries. The actual interval, the precise minutes between the moment the robber stepped through the door and the moment the next customer arrived and realized something was wrong, is the core black box in this case. To grasp why that gap has haunted investigators for decades, picture the station step by step. You pull off Route 4. The pavement under your tires gives way to a rougher surface, a mix of gravel and packed dirt stained with years of oil drips. The building is simple, rectangular, one-story, windows that give only a partial view of the interior. If you're pulling in during daylight, you might see the flicker of fluorescent fixtures through the glass. At night, those same lights are a beacon in the dark. Open the door, and a small bell or chime sounds. It's not there to deter thieves. It's there so the person in the back room knows a customer has arrived. The door closes, the bell stops, and the dominant sounds become smaller. The faint hum of the cooler at the back wall, the tick of a clock, Maybe the whine of a compressor from the service bay if work is being done on a car. On the day Everett was shot, someone walked into that environment with a firearm and a different agenda. There was no video system to capture the approach. No exterior camera to pick up the make and model of the suspect's vehicle. No interior angle to later show body language, distance between the gunman and victim, and position of hands at the crucial second. Everything about the encounter has to be inferred, from the position of Everett's body, from blood patterns, from the location and path of any bullets or shell casings the investigators recovered, and from whatever cash or items were missing. What we do know is that Everett ended up on the floor behind the counter, exactly where a clerk stands to run the register. That tells us something basic but important. The confrontation unfolded at the heart of the station's business. This was not a shooting outside by the pumps. This was face-to-face inside. When the next person arrived and walked through that same door, they were not expecting a murder scene. They were expecting to pay for gas, ask about a service, or just grab something small. Instead, they looked over the counter and saw a man on the ground. That is the moment when the quiet geography of Andover stopped being a backdrop and became part of the problem. Rural crime scenes in the 1960s faced a set of difficulties we don't always appreciate today. Response times were longer. The number of trained investigators who could get to a scene quickly was limited. The distance to the nearest crime lab was significant. Every minute that passed between the shooting, the discovery, the call to authorities, and the arrival of the first officer gave the robber more time to get away and more time for the scene to change. Think about the chain of events inside that station once the body was found. First, the shoot. A customer sees Everett on the ground. Maybe they call out his name. No response. They realize he's bleeding, or they see the location of the wound and understand this isn't a slip and fall. In that moment, instinct takes over. They might rush behind the counter, touch him, shake him, check his breathing, and look for a pulse. Every one of those actions is understandable, and every one of them risks altering evidence. They then have to decide how to get help. This is 1966. There is no 911 system across much of the United States yet, and where it exists, it's not uniform. Some places still rely on direct calls to the local operator or police department. So the witness either uses the station's phone or runs to the nearest other business or residence with a phone. In those minutes, the scene behind the counter is frozen in one sense. Everett is on the ground, the physical evidence is where it fell, but it is also being slowly contaminated. Footprints. Smears. An open door letting in dust and even insects. People trying to help, stepping where they must to get to the victim. When law enforcement arrives, they are walking into a crime that has already been in progress for some time. The town's location, set amid hills and trees with a limited number of through roads, both helps and hurts the investigation. On one hand, there are only so many ways to drive away from that station. On the other hand, once you're a few miles out, you're in a network of rural roads with low traffic, few witnesses, and many places to disappear. The landscape itself works against clarity. Trees along the roadway restrict long sight lines. Curves and hills mean you often can't see more than a short distance ahead or behind. In a city, many people might see a fleeing car. In Andover, on that stretch, at that time, maybe nobody did. The other major factor is the era's forensic toolkit. In 1966, investigators could document the scene meticulously with photographs, sketches, and notes. They could collect any shell casings, bullets, and bloodstains. They could dust for fingerprints on the counter, register, door handles, and other obvious touch points. But they could not, at that time, extract DNA from trace biological material. They could not run a partial profile from a cigarette butt, a drop of sweat, or a hair and get a name from a database that didn't exist yet. They could compare fingerprints, if they had a suspect to compare them to, and if the prints on the scene were usable. They could attempt to match a bullet to a weapon, if they ever recovered a weapon. But without witnesses and without a clear suspect early on, those tools operate in a vacuum. Andover was not a town buzzing with strangers every hour, which cuts both ways. Any unfamiliar vehicle could stand out, or it could slip by unnoticed because there were simply not enough people out on the road to see it and remember it. A robber from outside the area could plan around that reality, hit the station in a narrow time window when regulars were least likely to come through, then leave quickly onto state roads that fed into other towns and counties. The result is a paradox. A crime committed in a confined, easily described space, in a town with a limited number of access points, that nevertheless produces almost no public-facing, specific leads for the community to latch onto. When we look back on this case now, with the benefit of decades of advances in forensic science and investigative practice, the questions are obvious. What was taken during the attempted robbery? How much cash was in the drawer before and after? Were there any unusual vehicles reported in the area? Did anyone notice a stranger in the station in the hours leading up to the shooting? What physical evidence was collected and preserved? Some of those answers sit in case files not open to the public. Others are lost to time, to memories that faded or witnesses who died. What does filter out, through official summaries and later cold case write-ups, is the outline. This was an attempted robbery turned shooting at a small gas station in Potter Place, Andover. A clerk, a father, a veteran, was shot behind his own counter. He lingered for some time afterwards before dying from his injuries. No one was charged during his lifetime. For the people of Andover, this was not an abstract crime statistic. It was a jarring break in the town's sense of itself. You have to picture what the town looked like beyond the crime scene tape. Houses are set back from the road. Woodlets and modest farms. The railroad line cutting through, its old depot at Potter Place a reminder of an earlier era when the train brought visitors and freight on a predictable schedule. The station where Everett worked was part of that inherited infrastructure, an evolution of the town's role as a stop along a route, a place you pass through, refuel, and keep going. The murder turned that role on its head. For weeks, maybe months afterwards, every time a resident pulled up to buy gas, they were confronted with the knowledge that someone had come into this same space and fired a weapon at a man they knew. For travelers, it became another anonymous station along a state road. For locals, it was a crime scene embedded in daily life. The limitations of 1960s forensics meant that even if investigators did an exemplary job with what they had, photographs, diagrams, measurements, physical evidence, they were still missing tools we now take for granted. This gap between then and now is part of what keeps the case alive in the public imagination. Years later, when states like New Hampshire established dedicated cold case units, the Delano homicide was one of the cases that drew renewed attention. Old evidence was re-evaluated in light of newer scientific methods. Items that had been collected and sealed in the 1960s but could not be fully exploited at the time became potential sources of DNA and other trace evidence. But to understand why that renewed work mattered, and how it eventually produced leads that simply were not possible in the year of the shooting, you first have to sit with the original scene as it was on that day. A single-story station on a rural road, a clerk lying behind his own counter, and a community that never expected its town name to end up in a homicide file. This is not a big city mystery with dozens of surveillance angles, multiple overlapping witness statements, and a thick stack of suspect profiles. It is the opposite, a case defined by what wasn't there, no eyewitness to the moment of the shooting, no immediate suspect, and at that time, no scientific avenue to squeeze more information from what the killer left behind. That emptiness is the space this story lives in. Over the next sections, we'll look closely at who Everett Delano was, how he came to be in that station on that day, what we can reconstruct of the timeline before and after the shooting, how the forensic puzzle evolved from 1960s methods to later re-examinations, and why, despite major developments, this case still raises hard questions about justice, closure, and what it means for a community when a killing goes unresolved for decades. For now, keep this picture in mind. A quiet two-lane road. A small station in Potter Place. A bell on the door. A man behind the counter. And then, abruptly, a gunshot that no one in town saw coming. Before Everett Delano became a case file, he was a man doing a job most people would consider unremarkable. Public records describe him as Everett H. Delano, a middle-aged New Hampshire man, a Navy veteran, and a working member of the local community. He lived in Wilmot, a small town just west of Andover. Wilmot and Andover are the kind of places that blur into each other if you're not paying attention. A few miles of two-lane road separate them, Woods, small clearings, the occasional house set back from the shoulder. On paper, he'd served his country. He'd settled into civilian life. He worked with his hands. He had people who relied on him. That's the frame you have to keep in mind when you picture him behind the counter of a rural gas station. Wilmette in the 1960s was quieter even than Andover. Fewer businesses, more distance between neighbors. If you wanted steady work and you were willing to show up and handle a mix of manual labor and customer service, a gas station or service garage on Route 4 or 11 was a logical fit. Cars needed fuel. Trucks needed repairs. The state routes didn't stop just because the town was small. The station in Potter Place, Andover, where Everett was working when he was shot, sat in that space between local and through traffic. It served both. The local customers would have known the men behind the counter by name. They knew who usually pumped their gas, who could fix a tire, and who would extend a little credit if you were short that week. The through traffic barely registered the individual, just the function, a man in work clothes, maybe with a name patch, taking cash and handing back change. For Everett, the job meant routine. He would drive from Wilmette toward Andover, following the same stretches of road day after day. Trees tight to the roadside. A few clearings. The occasional view of low hills if you looked past the tree line. In winter, those roads would be edged in snowbanks, with plows carving lanes. In late summer and fall, around the time of the shooting, they were ringed with dense green, fields beginning to yellow, and the first hints of color in the higher leaves. At the station, the routine would continue. Open up if it was an early shift. Turn on the lights. Check the pumps. Make sure there's change in the drawer. Maybe start a pot of coffee. During the day, he'd handle a predictable sequence of tasks: fuel sales, minor mechanical questions, the small talk that fills space while a tank is being topped off. In a town this size, small talk matters. It's where you hear who's sick, who got a new truck, which kid just left for basic training, and what the weather did to someone's hay crop. That's the life Everett was living. Consistent, known, built on routine and local connection. He was not in a high-risk job by the standards of the time. He was not working in a major city, not handling large volumes of cash, not operating in a place known for armed robberies. He was behind the counter of a gas station in rural New Hampshire in the mid-1960s. The contrast between that reality and the violence of his death is one of the things that still makes this case hard to accept, even decades later. He had already done the dangerous part of his life. Navy service meant risk. Time in uniform, at sea or on bases, carried inherent hazards. Surviving that and coming back to small-town New Hampshire should have been the safe chapter. Instead, the fatal threat came later, in the most ordinary setting he could have imagined. When you strip the case back to the human level, you get a simple, blunt picture. A man who had spent his early adulthood under the authority and structure of the military transitioned to the looser, slower structure of rural civilian work. He showed up at a station on Route 4 in Potter Place. He did what thousands of clerks and mechanics did across the country every day. He stood behind a counter ringed with the tools of his trade: a cash register, stacks of receipts, maybe a clipboard, maybe a cup of coffee cooling nearby. He had no reason to expect anything out of the ordinary. The setting around him was not one of tension. Outside, the geography of Andover was doing what it always did. The old railroad line sat just beyond, its tracks or railed a reminder of a time when trains defined movement. The Blackwater River cut through town elsewhere, unseen from the station but shaping the lay of the land and the routes of the roads. Hills rose modestly in the distance, covered in forest. For someone like Everett, that landscape wasn't scenic, it was just home. The kind of home you count on to stay the same. Inside the station, the sensory environment was controlled and familiar. Overhead fluorescents humming softly. The dense, slightly sweet smell of gasoline drifted in every time the door opened. Rubber, oil, and exhaust are embedded in the concrete floor and the walls. A cooler at the back, its compressors cycling on and off. The metallic clink of coins, the crisp snap of bills, the push and ding of the register. There is no record of Everett expressing fear or concern about his safety at work. There is no indication he expected a threat. In a big city, A night shift clerk might think about robberies every time a new customer walked in wearing a hat low over their eyes. In Andover, the mental calculation was different. Most people behind counters in towns like this expected boredom, not danger. That's the pivot point in understanding the victim. He was not a man courting risk. He was not engaged in criminal activity. He was a veteran and working resident doing a straightforward job when lethal violence intruded on that routine. The official cold case summaries are sparse on personal color, no long biographies, no detailed family history. What we do know is that he had a life outside that station. The word family comes up in descriptions. That tells you enough. Someone waited for him to come home. Someone got the call that he'd been shot. From an investigative standpoint, that matters. When police look at a homicide, they examine victimology. Who was this person? What conflicts did they have? What risks were they exposed to? In Everett's case, the answer funnels back to the same place again and again. His exposure at that station on that day. There is no indication he was targeted for who he was. Everything suggests he was targeted for who he was and what he represented in that moment. The human obstacle between a robber and the cash in the drawer. But to reduce him to the clerk is to miss the full picture. He was a veteran who'd survived military service. He was a resident of rural New Hampshire, familiar with the roads, the weather, the rhythm of the seasons. He was a worker trusted enough to be alone at a business handling money and property. These are not anonymous traits. They are the profile of a stable, ordinary, reliable person. When that kind of person dies violently in a town like Andover, the shock doesn't just hit the family. It hits the community's sense of safety. If a Navy veteran in his late 40s, working a routine shift at a small station, can be shot during an attempted robbery, then the gap between Andover and the kind of violence people associate with elsewhere collapses. Years later, when the case is summarized in a few lines on a state cold case website, it can read flat. But you have to translate that line back into reality. A man in work clothes, behind a counter in a one-story building off Route 4, thinking through a to-do list that probably included nothing more dramatic than inventory, minor repairs, and heading home when his shift ended. Instead, someone walked in with a weapon. Instead, he ended his life on that concrete floor. He was not a mystery figure. He was not a shadowy character. He was the kind of person you see a dozen times a week and don't think twice about. The person who takes your cash, hands you your change, and wishes you a good day. Until one day, he's not there anymore. And the station floor tells you why. With a homicide in a controlled space like a gas station, investigators try to break the day into segments, windows of time that can be checked, corroborated, or at least reasonably inferred. In Everett Delano's case, much of the exact minute-by-minute record sits in reports not available to the public. But using what is known about the location, the job, and the era, we can outline the day in operational terms. 1. The start of the day. It's 1966 in rural New Hampshire. The station at Potter Place doesn't run on 24-hour big city hours. It opens in the morning and closes at night, timed to local traffic and the habits of the regulars. At the start of Everett's shift, the routine would have been unremarkable. Arrive from Wilmot by car along familiar back roads. Unlock the station if he's on opening duty. Lights on. Pumps checked. Register counted. The small rituals of readiness, setting out a notepad, checking the change drawer, making sure the receipt book is where it belongs. There is no sense, at this point, that the day will be any different from the one before. The geography outside is steady. Route 4 brings in a predictable flow, commuters, locals heading toward work or school, trucks moving between towns, the occasional traveler cutting across the state. The station sits just off that flow, a small interruption in the linear path of the road. Inside, Everett's world is about transactions. 2. The midday window. In most such robberies, timing matters. Offenders choose windows where there is enough cash accumulated to make the risk worth it. There are fewer customers, reducing the chance of witnesses. In a rural setting, that often means late morning or early afternoon, busy enough earlier that some money has come through, quiet enough between rushes that the station might be empty of customers. At some point in that window, Everett is in his usual position, behind the counter, near the register, within arm's reach of the cigarettes and whatever small goods the station carries. The soundscape is minimal. A car passing outside on Route 4. The faint whoosh of a vehicle pulling into the lot, if there is one. Inside, the cooler's compressor and the buzz of fluorescent tubes. If a car pulls in, a prospective customer or the eventual robber, Everett will hear it, but only in general terms. Gravel under tires. Engine idling. A door slam. Footsteps. Nothing about that sequence, by itself, signals danger. 3. The entry. What happens next is the core blind spot. Someone opens the door. The bell or chime announces entry. At that exact second, we can be confident of 3 things. 1. Everett is alive. 2. He is in or near his clerk's position behind the counter. 3. The robber has not yet fired the gun. Everything else, tone of voice, first words exchanged, whether the weapon is immediately visible, has to be inferred. The station layout forces the interaction into a narrow set of possibilities. The counter is fixed. The register is in a known location. The quickest path to the money is across that small, defined space. If this is a classic robbery pattern, the suspect moves toward the counter, weapon either already out or drawn as they approach. Demands are made, money from the till. Possibly orders, don't move. Don't say anything. If the weapon is visible from the start, Everett's choices are limited. Compliance is the standard survival strategy. But compliance doesn't always prevent violence. If the weapon is not visible at first, the transition from normal transaction to threat is abrupt and close range. In either scenario, the separation between Everett and the robber is probably no more than a few feet. It's a confined environment, a narrow strip of floor on the customer side, a narrow working space on the clerk's side. For the moment of violence. Official summaries state that Everett was shot during an apparent robbery. That phrase implies force was used to facilitate theft. Money or goods were the immediate motive. The shot, or shots, have to be understood in context. In a small room, a gunshot is deafening. On a rural road with intermittent traffic, it can still go unnoticed if no one is close by and passing vehicles mask the noise. Inside, for Everett, there is no masking. At the moment the trigger is pulled, everything compresses into that sound, the impact, and the immediate aftermath. He ends up on the floor behind the counter. That detail is consistent across sources. That tells us he did not collapse outside or in the aisle. He was in the core work zone at the time of the shooting. The physical conflict, if any, occurred in that tight space. Whether he fell straight down from an upright position or tried to move backwards, sideways, or down before collapsing is the kind of detail investigators study from blood patterns and impact marks. For the public narrative, what matters is this. When the scene is discovered, Everett is already on the floor, already beyond helping himself. The robber now has a narrow but critical window, seconds to a minute. Grab the cash. Possibly check Everett's condition, though most offenders don't. Decide whether to take anything else. Exit. Every second spent inside increases risk. Every second spent inside leaves more traces, more steps, more touch points, more opportunities for forensic recovery. In 1966, the robber is counting on one thing: time before discovery. 5. The departure. We don't have a license plate, a vehicle description, or an eyewitness to the actual departure in the public record. But we know the basic options. The robber exits, crosses the threshold, and moves back toward a vehicle parked near the pumps or off to the side. Or the robber leaves on foot, planning to reach a parked car out of view, or to use nearby woods or structures as cover. Given the rural setting and the era, a vehicle is almost certain. Walking away from a robbery on a state route in daylight is riskier than driving off. The roads leaving Potter Place offer several routes. East or west along Route 411, blending into regional traffic. Side roads leading north or south into more isolated residential and wooded areas. Within minutes, the car, if there was one, is beyond Andover's immediate orbit. 6. The discovery. At some later point, minutes, maybe longer, another person pulls into the same station. The sequences are almost identical to earlier, until the moment of entry. Car stops. Door opens. Bell or chime sounds as the door swings. But this time, no clerk stands behind the counter. The sensory differences are subtle at first. No greeting. No movement behind the register. A stillness that doesn't fit the normal script. The customer might call out, "Hello. Anybody here?" Silence in response. Some people would wait. Some would look around, thinking the clerk has stepped into the back or the service bay. Some might tap on the counter. At some point, the line of sight shifts, over the counter, down toward the floor on the other side. That's when Everett is seen. He is on the ground. There is blood. His position tells the story. This is not someone who fainted. That realization triggers the next chain. Approach the counter more closely. Move around to the employee side, stepping into the zone that investigators later need to reconstruct. Check for any sign of life, breathing, movement, response to voice, a pulse. In those moments, the scene is being actively altered by necessity. A body is being touched. Blood might be smeared. Items might be moved. The next step is to raise the alarm. In 1966, this means using the station's own phone if accessible to call for help, or running or driving to the nearest business or residence with a phone. Who they call, local operator, town police, county sheriff, state police, depends on what numbers they know and what system is in place at that time in this part of New Hampshire. But once that call goes through, a new clock starts. 7. The response. Law enforcement and medical responders have to reach a rural scene. That takes time. Officers and rescue personnel have to be dispatched from wherever they are when the call comes in. They navigate the same two-lane roads, the same curves and hills, in vehicles that are not as fast or as well-equipped as modern patrol cars and ambulances. When they arrive, the exterior of the station looks ordinary. Pumps, building, open door. Inside, the crime is immediately clear. An injured clerk, blood, signs of struggle or at least sudden violence. Medical priority comes first. If Everett is still alive when responders arrive, and records indicate he survived for a period after the shooting, he is stabilized as much as possible on scene and transported for further care. This is another crucial time factor. Every second spent treating and moving the victim takes trained eyes away from the untouched scene. But there is no alternative. Save the life if it is still possible. Once Everett is removed, the station space is both cleared and emptied of its most important witness. With the victim in transit or at the hospital, officers can shift more fully into preservation mode. The station is cordoned off. Doors may be closed to limit additional contamination. Anyone who has been inside since the shooting, discovering customer, bystanders, initial responders, is identified for later interviews and elimination as sources of trace evidence. The timeline from shot to lockdown is now set. Unknown moment of shooting. Unknown interval until discovery. Known, to investigators, time of call. Known arrival time of first unit. Known arrival time of ambulance/medical support. Known time of victim's removal. For investigators, that stack of times is critical. It brackets the unknown. It tells them the earliest possible time of the shooting. The latest possible time, discovery. The window through which the robber could have left the immediate area. But in a rural context, even a tight window leaves plenty of room to vanish. A car traveling at normal speed can be miles away in 10 minutes, in a different jurisdiction in 20. 2. The cash and the register. Because official accounts call it an apparent robbery, money is central to the forensic puzzle. Investigators would have asked the owner/manager how much cash was normally in the till at that time of day. Determined whether large bills were missing. Looked for signs of the drawer being forced or hurriedly emptied. The register itself is a high-value evidence surface. The drawer handle. The keys or buttons. The area around the bills and coins. Fingerprints here could belong to Everett, co-workers, regular customers who handled things they shouldn't have. The robber. The problem in 1966, any latent prints had to be developed with powder or chemical means, photographed, lifted, and then compared manually, one fingerprint card at a time, against known prints from suspects or state/local files. There is no instant database search. So even if the robber left a clear, full print on the drawer, that print is only as useful as the quality of the lift, the existence of a matching set of prints in some accessible record, the time and will to perform the comparison. If the suspect had never been fingerprinted for military service, prior arrests, or employment that required it, that latent print would sit in the evidence file as a future tool, but only if technology caught up and the print was preserved properly. 3. The ballistics. If the shooter used a semi-automatic handgun, ejected shell casings may have been left at the scene. If a revolver, casings may have left with the gun, still in the cylinder. Investigators would recover any shell casings, any bullet fragments in walls, counters, or lodged in Everett's body, later at autopsy. These then go to a firearms examiner. The examiner can determine caliber, compare bullets and casings to test-fired rounds from a seized weapon, identify unique rifling patterns, extractor marks, and firing pin impressions to match the bullet/casing to the gun. But that only works if a suspect weapon is ever recovered. That weapon is submitted for testing. The examiner is given both the evidence and the firearm. In a robbery where the offender is unknown, the odds of the gun being found without another crime attached are low. For trace evidence, the scene offers potential trace materials: fibers from clothing caught on rough surfaces, hair on or near the counter, cigarette butts if smoking were allowed inside, tool marks if drawers or cabinets were forced. In 1966, the main uses for these were limited. Hair, basic microscopic comparison, human versus animal, rough race estimation, but no individualization. Fibers, type and color, could be associated with a specific garment if that garment is seized. Cigarette butts might reveal saliva containing blood-type markers, but not identity. However, if those items were collected and preserved, they could become crucial decades later in the DNA era. That's the long-term forensic puzzle. Which of those small, easily overlooked items were bagged, labeled, and stored properly? 5. The body as evidence. Everett himself is a forensic source. At the hospital and later at autopsy, examiners can determine the number and location of gunshot wounds, recover bullets or fragments, document soot, stippling, or lack thereof to estimate muzzle distance. Note any defensive injuries, abrasions, bruises, cuts that suggest a struggle. If the robber came close enough, or if there was any hand-to-hand contact before or after the shot, Everett's skin, nails, or clothing might harbor skin cells from the assailant. Hair or fibers transferred during the struggle. In 1966, that material might be observed but not understood in DNA terms. At best, it could be saved for potential future analysis or used for blood typing if blood from two people is mixed. If those samples were archived properly, they would later form the backbone of any DNA-based cold case work. 6. The missing pieces. What makes Everett's case a forensic puzzle, rather than a solved story, is the combination of a confined arena of violence, a known victim with no clear enemies, no publicly documented, immediate suspect, and a set of physical traces that, at the time, could not be leveraged fully. Decades later, cold case units in many states pulled those boxes from storage. Some cases yielded usable DNA from old clothing, preserved swabs, cigarette butts, discarded drink containers. In other crimes, those profiles were matched to offenders already in databases or identified through forensic genealogy. Public information on the Delano case confirms that modern techniques have been applied to re-examine evidence. What is not fully disclosed to the public is the exact chain, which item produced which profile, whether any single individual has been definitively linked to the scene through DNA, and how those results interact with other investigative findings. What is clear is this: the forensic story of this case begins in 1966 with chalk outlines, film cameras, and fingerprint powder, and extends into an era of genetic analysis and long-term evidence storage. The puzzle remains: can the physical traces from that small station ever fully close the gap between an unidentified robber and a name, beyond a reasonable doubt? A homicide in a town like Andover ripples outward fast. Once the initial shock hits, once word spreads that a man has been shot at the station, police face two simultaneous demands. 1. Work the case methodically. 2. Reassure a community that is not used to this kind of violence. 1. Immediate canvass. The first wave of the investigation is basic police work. Officers and, likely, state police investigators move out from the station in widening circles. They stop at nearby homes and businesses. They ask who saw what, cars, strangers, unusual behavior, in the hours before the shooting. They check whether anyone heard a gunshot, a shout, or a commotion. In a city, this might mean dozens of potential witnesses in a few blocks. In rural Andover, the circle hits trees, fields, and widely spaced houses. The limits of geography show up immediately. There may simply not be many people who were in a position to see or hear anything. They also check the roads. Patrols move along Route 411 looking for any vehicle that matches even vague descriptions. They watch for nervous driving, unusual stops on the roadside, and cars parked where they normally wouldn't be. But the time delay works against them. By the time the search is underway, the offender may already be far from the scene. 2. Known quantities. Investigators then look inward. Who knew Everett's schedule? Were there any local individuals with a history of theft, robbery, or violence? Had any similar crimes, attempted robberies at gas stations, armed holdups, occurred in nearby towns? They pull arrest records, talk to other departments, and check for patterns. Same type of weapon? Same kind of target, small gas stations on rural routes? Similar time of day? If they identify potential suspects, they interview them. Check alibis. Look for physical evidence linking them to the scene. Compare fingerprints if available. But without eyewitness identification or a strong physical link, these suspects remain just that, names in a list, not defendants in a courtroom. 3. Regional coordination. In the 1960s, New Hampshire law enforcement worked within a patchwork of town, county, and state structures. A homicide in a small-town gas station is serious enough to draw in state police investigators. They, in turn, communicate with neighboring departments, regional agencies in Vermont and Maine, especially if patterns of similar crimes emerge. Bulletins go out. Description of the crime. Basic victim details. Any tentative suspect or vehicle description, if one emerges from the canvas. But without a clear lead, these bulletins become background noise in the daily churn of law enforcement communications. The dead-end phase. Most unsolved homicides hit a point where the incoming information curve flattens. The first surge of tips dries up. People with relevant information have already come forward, or decided not to. The physical evidence has been processed as far as current technology allows. In Everett's case, that phase would have come after. Initial interviews with family, colleagues, and anyone who'd been at the station that day. Collection and evaluation of physical evidence. Cross-checks of known local troublemakers. Comparison against other robberies. If no one cracks under questioning, if no one brags in a bar, if no gun surfaces connected to another crime and then matches the ballistics from Potter Place, the case enters a holding pattern. The file is not closed, but it moves from the front of the desk to a cabinet. 5. The cold case era. Decades later, as forensic science advances and public attention to unsolved homicides grows, New Hampshire, like many states, formalizes its approach to old cases. A cold case unit is established. The Delano homicide makes the list. Cold case investigators do not start from scratch. They start with the original reports, scene photographs, evidence logs and property room inventories, autopsy findings. What was done? What was not done because it wasn't possible then? What assumptions were made that might not hold up now? They re-interview, where possible, surviving witnesses, former officers and detectives who worked the original case, family members, for context and any long-held suspicions. Then they look at the evidence itself. Items that might be retested include clothing from Everett, if preserved, swabs or slides created by early investigators, cigarette butts, drink containers, or other personal items left in the station. Any objects handled by the robber that were bagged and saved. In numerous cold cases around the country, this is where breakthroughs have happened. Swabs taken decades earlier, now processed for DNA and matched via state or federal offender databases. Advanced comparison techniques. In some jurisdictions, forensic genealogy uses DNA relatives. Public reporting suggests that Everett's case did receive this kind of renewed forensic attention. State press releases over the years reference progress in long-dormant homicide investigations using modern science. What has not been laid out in granular public detail is whether this produced a fully identified suspect whose DNA was on preserved evidence, a strong but circumstantial lead, or results that narrowed the field but did not close it. Leads but no trial. In many legacy cases, the modern pattern looks like this. Investigators identify a likely offender through new techniques. That person is deceased or otherwise unavailable for trial. The case is declared cleared by death internally, but there is no courtroom verdict. From the public side, it can look like an unsolved crime forever frozen in the cold case category, even if, behind the scenes, the picture is more developed. For Everett's case, there are indications that investigative work has continued well into the modern era, with law enforcement at times signaling that they have a clearer view of what happened and who may have been responsible. Yet, in the absence of a public trial, sworn testimony, and a judicial finding, the story remains, in a legal sense, officially unresolved. And that brings us to what we can say now from an investigative journalism standpoint about the verdict. When you talk about the verdict in a case like Everett H. Delano's, you're not talking about a judge banging a gavel. There has been no jury seated, no defense counsel cross-examining witnesses, no formal reading of guilt or innocence in a New Hampshire courtroom tied directly to his shooting. Instead, there are three overlapping verdicts. 1. The legal status of the case. 2. The investigative consensus, what law enforcement believes, even if it can't or hasn't been fully tested in court. 3. The community's understanding, how the family and town think about what happened. 1. Legal status. Based on official public listings and long-running references in New Hampshire's cold case materials, the homicide of Everett H. Delano has been treated for years as an unresolved crime. That means, no one has been convicted in court for his killing. No official in the justice system has publicly closed the file as solved in the way a normal criminal case would be. Legally, the case remains open. There is no statute of limitations on murder. If at any point new evidence surfaces that meets the evidentiary standard, prosecutors can still bring charges against a living suspect. 2. Investigative consensus. Law enforcement agencies don't publish every detail of their working theories. They can't. To do so would compromise potential future prosecutions, risk contaminating witness testimony, expose investigative methods and evidence that are more effective when kept confidential. What we can say, relying on public statements and the patterns of similar cases, is investigators have revisited the Delano homicide. They have retested preserved evidence using modern techniques where possible. They have likely narrowed the circle of potential suspects. Whether they have a single name that they internally treat as the likely offender is not fully documented in the public domain. In some cold cases, attorneys general later hold press conferences to say, "We are confident that X committed this crime. He is deceased, and as such, this case is now considered closed." In others, they stop short of that, acknowledging progress without naming names. In Everett's case, absent a widely reported official identification, we have to treat it as unresolved in the public record, even if the internal picture is sharper than it was in 1966. 3. Community understanding. For Andover and for Everett's family, the verdict is more emotional and less technical. A man went to work at a gas station. He ended up shot behind his own counter. Whoever did that walked away and was never publicly held to account. Whether or not law enforcement now believes they know who that person was, the community has not sat through a trial. There has been no public presentation of the evidence, no opportunity to hear witnesses testify under oath, no formal acknowledgement of guilt by a judge or jury. From a family perspective, that matters. It is one thing to suspect, to hear from investigators that they are confident in a theory. It is another to see that theory tested in court and reduced to a formal finding. 4. The limits of closure. Closure is a misleading word in homicide cases. Even when a suspect is arrested, convicted, and imprisoned, families rarely speak of closure. What they talk about is accountability and recognition, the system publicly affirming that what happened was wrong, that it mattered, and that someone is being held responsible. In Everett's case, the absence of a courtroom verdict means no sentencing hearing where the impact on his family and community is laid out on the record. No formal recognition of the crime's full human cost. This is not simply a procedural gap, it is a psychological one. 5. What we do know, firmly. Despite the uncertainties, some core facts are solid. Everett H. Delano, a Navy veteran and Wilmette resident, was shot while working at a gas station in Potter Place, Andover, New Hampshire, in 1966. The shooting occurred during what authorities describe as an apparent robbery. He was found on the floor behind the counter and later died from his injuries. As of the last widely available official information, no one has stood trial and been convicted for his murder. Those facts define the case in the public record. Everything else, suspected identity of the offender, possible connections to other crimes, potential motive nuances beyond simple robbery, is either investigatively sensitive or not fully established in a way that can withstand court scrutiny. 6. The role of time. Time alters homicide cases in two opposing ways. It weakens them. Witnesses die, memories fade, physical evidence degrades. It strengthens them. Forensic technologies improve, investigative techniques advance, and patterns across multiple cases may emerge. For Everett's homicide, time has done both. It has taken away some potential living witnesses, placed the original investigators into retirement or beyond, but it has also allowed retesting of old biological evidence, encouraged more systematic review by specialized cold case units. The verdict, then, is this. Legally, the case is open and officially unresolved. Investigatively, it has been actively re-examined and is not forgotten. For the family and community, it remains a wound tied to a specific place and time, not yet formally healed by public justice. And that is why, nearly 6 decades later, the life of Everett Delano still demands to be spoken of in the present tense, not only as a closed chapter in a database. Which brings us to the part that too often gets lost in crime reporting, the tribute. When you strip a homicide down to dates, calibers, and timelines, you risk losing the person at the center of it. In the official language, Everett becomes the victim or the clerk. In case summaries, his name is followed by his age and the manner of death. But those short lines conceal a full human life. What we know from public information is straightforward. His name, Everett H. Delano. His status, Navy veteran, resident of Wilmette, New Hampshire. His work, employed at a gas station in Potter Place, Andover. His age at death, late 40s. From that base, we can say, factually and without embellishment, that he chose to serve his country in uniform, returned to civilian life in a small New Hampshire town, took on the kind of steady, unglamorous work that keeps communities functioning. He was part of the infrastructure of daily life, someone others relied on for fuel, small repairs, and the simple continuity of a business being open when people needed it. In a town like Wilmette, and in a work setting like a small gas station, anonymity is impossible in the long term. People know who you are. They know your habits. They know broadly your story. For his family, Everett was not a case reference. He was a provider, a relative whose voice and mannerisms they could describe in detail. A person with routines, when he liked to get up, how he drove that road between Wilmette and Andover, the way he handled a day's problems. His military service marks a clear point. He had already lived through environments more dangerous than a New Hampshire gas station. That he could come back from that, settle into a modest rural life, and then be killed in a routine robbery attempt is not just tragic. It is fundamentally senseless. The community impact also matters. In towns like Andover and Wilmette, A homicide doesn't get buried under headlines about dozens of other crimes. It stands out. People remember where they were when they heard. They remember driving past the taped-off station, seeing cruisers where they usually saw parked cars and pickup trucks. For those who knew Everett, or even just recognized him as the guy at the station, the loss reshaped their sense of safety. The station wasn't just a business. It was part of the daily map. A place you stopped on your way to work. A place you saw lit up on dark winter afternoons. A place your kids knew as a landmark. After the shooting, that map was altered. This tribute is not about idealizing Everett beyond what we can responsibly say. It is about recognizing. He served. He worked. He was killed in the course of that work. And for his family, every year that passes without full public resolution is another year in which those basic facts carry too much weight and too few answers. When we talk about forensic puzzles and investigative timelines, we are, ultimately, talking about efforts to honor that life by pursuing the truth of how it ended. The most honest tribute we can offer from a journalistic standpoint is this. To say his name clearly. To place it in its correct context. Wilmette, Andover, Potter Place, Route 4, 1966. To refuse to let the case description be the last word on who he was. Everett H. Delano was a Navy veteran, a working man, and a member of a small New Hampshire community. His last shift at that gas station should have ended with him turning off the lights, locking up, and driving home. It ended instead behind a counter on a concrete floor. That gap, between what should have happened and what did, is why this story still matters. Some cases stay unsolved because no one cares. This is not one of those cases. From the first officers on scene in 1966, through later state police and cold case units, people have worked Everett's homicide with the tools available at each stage in time. But tools are not the same as eyes on a case and voices willing to speak. There are still people alive who remember that station. There are still people who drove Route 4 that year. There may be someone who was told a story, half joking, half confessional, about something that happened at a gas station in New Hampshire. If you know anything about the shooting of Everett H. Delano at the gas station in Potter Place, Andover, no matter how small or old the detail, contact the New Hampshire Cold Case Unit or the New Hampshire State Police. Leads that seemed insignificant in 1966 can be critical when combined with modern forensic work. For Everett's family, for Wilmette, for Andover, a name and a documented truth matter. If you follow cases like this, cases that never made national headlines, that didn't get documentaries for decades, that's the work we do here. We dig into the files the news cycle forgot. Subscribe for more cases the news forgot. Because stories like Everett's don't belong at the bottom of an evidence box. They belong in the open until the truth catches up.